All right. Thank you for joining in. I think I will probably wait for a couple of more minutes for to allow people to just join, and then we can begin. So I'm just giving a minute or so for people to still join in. I can see a lot of people trickling in. So maybe a minute or so, and then we can begin with this webinar. Thanks for joining in. Hopefully, this will be something of a learning experience for a lot of people who have not seen this project. But having said that, looking for a lot of discussion in and around it. All right, so let's begin. So to begin with, let me introduce myself. My name is Swapnil. I am the Chief Network Security Engineer at Shreshta IT. I run the company as well. And what do? We primarily defend networks, as well as, apart from that, we do a lot of training activities in and around InfoSec. So I'm a technical trainer as well. I do a lot of workshops on information security as well as network security monitoring. I am also an AppNic community trainer as well. Hold on, I am getting reports of issues with sound. Let me see if I can fix that. Hopefully the issue is fixed. In case if people are still hearing an overlapping sound, please feel free and put it in the chat or the Q&A and let me know. So I'm an AppNic community trainer as well. I do a lot of training activities for APNIC or AppNic, which is basically an RIR, Regional Internet Registry. I am also an active participant and a speaker in a lot of conferences. Before the pandemic, I used to travel a lot and be an active participant as well as present in a number of network operator groups and security communities in the Asia Pacific region. And that's my Twitter handle. So in case if you have any questions at any point of time, please feel free and reach out to me. I am hoping the sound and video is all good. In case if there is any issue somebody is noticing, please feel free and put it in the chat. All right, so a little bit of housekeeping. So in the context of this specific webinar, what I have in mind is a duration of roughly 1.5 hours. That's a huge chunk of time from a webinar context. But having said that, Hopefully, I'll be as brief as possible. At the same time, this webinar adds value in a lot of ways, looking at, let's say, putting a defense in your home network, right? And so this is very fluid in the context that the webinar might just end at an hour or so, or it may extend depending on Q&A and stuff like that. If you have any questions at any point of time, please put the questions in the Zoom Q&A, or you can put it in the Discord server. So we have a Discord server as well. Here is a link, and you can also raise your hand. So in case if you would like to ask a question, you can raise your hand, and I can make sure that we can unmute, and then you can ask your question. This webinar is being recorded, and a recording of this will be put on YouTube. We have a freshly created YouTube channel. So that is where we are hoping to put all these videos as well. So here is the agenda. So what I have in store with regards to this webinar is to briefly talk about the network defense series at home and what's in store. So this is one specific webinar that I'm doing right now. But having said that, there is a succession of webinars that we have chalked out, and depending on the feedback, we will pursue it accordingly. I'll talk about security in layers so that people get an understanding that the Pi-hole project is just one element of it. It's not going to cater to all the layers of security. There are multiple layers that need to be addressed. Then I'll also talk about why Pi-hole, why it makes sense, and why you should be probably looking at installing Pi-hole in your home network or a SOHO kind of a network, right? Then I'll also do a quick demo so that I can show you quickly installing Pi-hole and how easy it is to primarily get this up and running. And finally, take all the questions based on what I demonstrate here. So at any point of time you have any questions, do not wait till the very end. You can go ahead and put it in the Zoom Q&A, or you can put it in the chat, or you can put it in the Discord channel. So depending on every now and then, I'll take a break and I'll pause for a minute, and I'll look at the questions and take it from there. So a little bit of background in the context of why we are doing this, the Network Defense at Home series. So from a company perspective, Shreshta IT's roots actually began with catering to securing small or SOHO networks. So that's how we primarily were focused on at the very inception stage. And over a period of time, we have looked at, and these were enterprise or SOHO kind of setups. But over a period of time, we have largely grown at looking at you can say enterprises which are in the mid segment or large enterprises per se. And I think with the pandemic and everyone working from home, as well as a lot of issues around privacy as well as security, we thought probably we should go back to the roots and talk a bit about a few open source solutions or software which can help you in looking at gaining that visibility into your network, even if it is a small network where it is just one computer or a laptop, or maybe you have a large fleet of IoT devices as well as other systems or laptops in your network. Gaining that visibility is extremely important. And hopefully this is one, in this context of this webinar, hopefully this specific tool or this specific project can, uncover what is happening in your network, right? Having said that, I think, as I mentioned, security is all about layers. The layered approach principle holds true in the context of security. This also holds true not only in the case of an enterprise network or a very large network, but I think it also holds true for any network per se, even if it is a flat network or a home network, right? And the Pi-hole project is basically looking at the DNS layer. It is primarily looking at the DNS transactions or the DNS queries. So there could be a lot of potential badness which could be there in the network by means of malware or phishing links or phishing domains or different kinds of malware which may not be using DNS to communicate. And in those, in that specific context, Pi-hole cannot help you, right? But having said that, Pi-hole, not only from a security perspective, Pi-hole is very useful in the context also to give you an visibility of what is happening in your network, right? So you have a smart TV or you have a IoT device, and you can potentially uncover a lot of telemetry, right? What is, if there is a particular device which is very chatty, which is probably sending a huge number of DNS requests to its mothership, right? And that is something that you can uncover with the Pi-hole. And apart from that, also in the context of security, there is a lot of ways in which you can block phishing domains or malware domains. And I'll probably go into that a bit in detail. Having said that, let me also point out the Pi-hole is not going to be useful in the context of applications or software which primarily use a protocol which is a very new protocol called as DOH, which stands for DNS over HTTPS. So the Pi-hole is basically not going to gain visibility there. But at this point of time, not all applications and software are using it. Having said that, the internet world is moving towards that, right? But hopefully with this project, at least to begin with, by putting this project in your home network per se or a SOHO network, maybe you can uncover, potentially badness or, potentially some kind of, traffic which you did not know about, right? So hopefully this helps you in that context. Now, so that was in the perspective of security. In the perspective of tracking, I'm sure people who are watching this part of this right now, as well as people who will look at this from a YouTube video perspective, will be aware that there are all these kind of ecosystems which are primarily after monetization, right? Where the whole point is to track you and profile you as a user of the internet, to find out what your interests are, what is it that you are interested to make a purchase of, and based on that show you all kind of ads and whatnot. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation has an article which talks about do not track, and they go in pretty much detail with regards to what kind of tracking is involved on the internet these days. Having said that, this is not a new activity. Tracking has been in existence for maybe around 20-30 years when the commercialization of the internet has happened. But having said that, I would also like to point out that the Pi-hole project will also allow you to kind of look at making sure that those tracking domains or those tracking websites which are trying to profile you, right, or fingerprint you, more specifically it is called as fingerprinting the device, where they look at the unique details of your browser, specific metadata regarding the browser and so on. But the Pi-hole can help you in that regard as well, to block all sorts of ads and stuff like that. So this is an article that I would like to point out people to. So in case if you would like to go more in detail, and there are a lot of papers that people have written with regards to way users are profiled on the internet or the users are tracked on the internet. Why Pi-hole? Visibility is, as I said, is the core element of understanding. If you do not see what is happening in your network, then you potentially have a blind spot where you don't know what needs to be protected, or potentially what malware is existing in your network, or what sort of tracking is also happening when you're accessing the internet, right? And in the context of Pi-hole, as I said, it works at the DNS layer. So everything on the internet begins with a DNS query. But having said that, if you need the full picture, so this Pi-hole will only provide you visibility at the DNS layer. So it will only tell you what domains, applications or software or apps are making behind the scenes, or even when you surf the internet and you have a Pi-hole in the network, it will tell you what sort of activity is happening from a DNS perspective, right? But if you need the full picture, you should explore network security monitoring, or something called as NSM. And I talked about this at a recent conference, which primarily involved looking at anomalies as well as patterns with regards to security. And I have a link to the video as well as the presentation in the references section of this presentation. So hopefully you can look into that, because that gives you full visibility. It's not just at the DNS layer, it's basically everything. Anything, even if there is a device which is communicating using an IP address and not a domain name, network security monitoring will allow you to uncover that, right? The other thing which Pi-hole is very useful, as I said, is to uncover telemetry, right? There are all these sorts of devices that you have at home, and all those devices are primarily communicating with their mothership, right? Mothership is nothing but their centralized servers, where it's sending information about, maybe you're watching Netflix and it is telling Netflix all the sorts of movies that you have seen and stuff like that, right? And Pi-hole will also allow you to gain insights into the volume of DNS requests. So every application, every app or any kind of device which is making a connection on the internet is going to use the DNS, right? Is going to communicate via a domain name. And Pi-hole is going to log that, and Pi-hole will tell you in a dashboard that here is what is happening in your network, right? And that visibility is very important, because that potentially can tell you whether if there is something wrong in your network, or if there is malware present in your network, right? So that is very useful. The other thing what Pi-hole can allow you to do is not only from a visibility perspective, but Pi-hole can also allow you to block ads, right? So you can block ads or more specifically domains which are used by these advertising companies. It also allows you to block trackers. So there are various sorts of ways in which, as I said, the profiling of users happens on the internet, as well as malware domains, right? So from privacy perspective, Pi-hole is a great project, and it's an open source software. So you typically can install it in your home network or a SOHO network, and hopefully also contribute in case if that by means of documentation, writing about it, or just the way I am doing, by spreading the word, right? So I have countless installations of Pi-hole which I have installed for family and friends, because it's just a Raspberry Pi which sits in their network, and as long as it's on and it's running, it blocks all sorts of ads, malware domains, and tracking domains. Bringing some sort of security in a home network, especially for a non-technical user, right? At any point of time, anyone has any questions, please feel free and put it in the Q&A or the Zoom chat, right? And I will make sure that I'll take I'll pause and answer questions at that point of time. So under the hood, Pi-hole is basically a DNS caching and a forwarder. So it basically uses a resolver software called as dnsmasq. Actually, it's not a resolver software. It's basically just a caching and a forwarder. So dnsmasq is the software that is being used by Pi-hole behind the scenes. And it can also act as a DHCP server, but having said that, that's optional. And I'll talk about DHCP and the relevance of it and what you need to do in order to make sure that once you install Pi-hole, some post-installation that needs to be done at your end, right? And to the Pi-hole, you can basically give something called as block lists. So these are basically, you can say, a list of all domains, which could be ads, list of all domain names, which are basically malware, list of all domain names, which is basically tracking domains, right? And I'll demonstrate this so that this becomes a lot simpler for people who are exploring Pi-hole for the first time. And in the screenshot on this specific slide, you can see that that's the dashboard that I was talking about. So this is the dashboard which tells you what sort of activity is happening on your network. And when I do the installation hands-on, hopefully you'll get a better idea. So what do you need in order to install the Pi-hole project? From a hardware perspective, very minimal requirements. You possibly require around 2 GB of free space, and 4 GB of is recommended. but even with 2 GB free space, you can install Pi-hole. Amount of memory required is 512 MB. So these screenshots or snippets have been taken from the Pi-hole documentation itself. So in that context, it potentially can run on a Raspberry Pi, and I use it by installing Raspberry Pi, as I said, for my family and friends. So you could also install it on, in case in a home network, if you do not have a Raspberry Pi, you could probably install it on a Intel NUC if you have it, or if you already have say for example a system lying around gathering dust, you could use that system, put maybe Linux on it, and then install Pi-hole, and you could utilize it that way. Or you could also install Pi-hole on your laptop as well, provided your laptop is running the Linux operating system. And the major distributions which are supported officially are Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, as well as CentOS, right? And it also supports the Raspberry Pi OS, which is the operating system for the one of the operating systems for the Raspberry Pi, right? And if you're a fan of Docker, Docker is officially supported as well. And that's about what you need. So from a computing perspective, very minimal requirements. Let's say from a cost perspective, even if you go to buy a Raspberry Pi, the 8 GB model with a case and an adapter and a memory card, I think the cost should probably roughly be around 5,000 to 6,000 rupees. Don't take my word for it, but that should briefly be, from a numbers perspective, that should be the cost to probably put a Raspberry Pi in your home network. But as I said, you could explore it in different ways. And having said that, what I will do is I will probably head to the installation so that I can talk a bit about how you could install the Pi-hole on a Linux operating system. So give me a minute. I am hoping that all of you are able to see the terminal screen. In case you are not, please feel free and let me know in the Q&A or the chat. I'm hoping the terminal screen is visible to everyone. So what I have here is basically a Linux VM. It's actually, I'm using Vagrant to primarily provision this, but ignore that bit. So what I have is an Ubuntu operating system, which is running the version 20.04.3. And in this context, let's go ahead and install the Pi-hole project. Let me pull up the documentation. So here we go. So what is happening is at the terminal, I am basically downloading the, using curl, using the command line tool curl. It's basically pulling the script to install Pi-hole. And a lot of times people will frown upon redirecting the output of a bash script, or rather downloading a script and then redirecting it to bash. But in this context, I know the script, and I have reviewed what is contained on that script a few minutes ago. And what it is doing is now it is looking at whether the architecture is supported. So in this context, it looks if the operating system where you are trying to run this script is supported. And once it does that, then it is going to load up an ncurses menu, which will allow us to basically install the Pi-hole project. In the meantime, let me see if there are any questions at this point of time. I don't see any. All right. So this is the screen where, this is the, you can say the setup wizard, which, will prompt you for a lot of questions with regards to how you want to configure the Pi-hole. And let's run through. Let's move on. So in this case, the Pi-hole says that it needs a static IP. So what we will do is, in my case, there are multiple interfaces available. So I will select the interface which has, which I want to basically configure as a static IP address. And the next screen talks about, as I said, the Pi-hole project uses dnsmasq, which is basically a caching and a forwarding piece of software. So what it will do is it needs a forwarder so that it can send the DNS request to that forwarder or rather the recursive resolver. So in this case, there are multiple options. There is all of these are the open resolvers. So Google runs an open resolver, which is 8.8.8.8 and so on. So is Quad 9, which is 9.9.9.9, and there is Cloudflare as well, right? To begin with, what I will do is I will select this specific option. Let's go with Google. But at a later point of time, I will talk about installing Unbound. So instead of using Google, we could actually use Unbound as the DNS recursive resolver. And I'll talk about benefits of doing that. But having said that, for now, let's keep this option as it is and move along. This is the screen where Pi-hole is talking about whether you would like to enable the block list that I was talking about. So Stephen Black is the host file. So it was also known as a host file. So in case if you are as old as me, and if you have ever used a host file to block domain names from resolving, the same host file is something that is is maintained by one of the project called as Stephen Black. The project is on GitHub. I have a link to this in the presentation slides. But this contains adware, malware, and there are multiple options, right? And I'll talk about this at a later point of time. So let's go ahead and keep this as it is. Let's make sure this is enabled. The next screen talks about whether we would like to block ads over IPv4 or IPv6. Unfortunately, my internet service provider does not give me IPv6 connectivity. So let me deselect IPv6. Let me move forward. The next thing is a very important step where it is asking you, do you want to use this specific IP address? So in my case, this is not the IP address that I want to use. So I will want to change this. So let me go ahead and change that. So this is based on my network, but in your case, it should. So when you run this, so my setup is a bit complicated and the way I have set it up. So in your case, it should auto detect and it should, you wouldn't have to set it manually. But in case if you'd like to do that, you can choose that option as well. And the next screen is, it talks about, do you want to install a web interface? I would highly urge you to do that because that's where the visibility aspect comes into the picture. The next screen talks about, do you want to install a web server as well as PHP modules? This option is also required in order for the web interface to work. So I would suggest we keep this option as it is and move along. The next one is, do you want to log queries? So in this case, we would like to do that because we would like to see what activity is happening in the dashboard, as well as gain a visibility in that perspective. So let's keep this option on as well. And finally, the last option, it talks about, do you want to show everything or hide domains and clients or run in anonymous mode? So in this case, we are setting this up for our home network. So in that context, I would say, let's go with show everything. So it will probably take a couple of minutes to download the repository via Git and complete the installation, and finally it will probably show us a screen which says that Pi-hole is installed on this specific IP, and this is how you can access it. And once you have accessed it, it also shows you the password. But I'll show you a different method on how you could change the password as well. Any questions? Vinayak has a question. What does ECS mean? Yeah, so ECS basically stands for the eDNS client subnet. So there is a specific RFC for eDNS client subnet. So in the context of geographically for name servers, for authoritative name servers, this is nothing to do with Pi-hole. The question that Vinayak has was in the context of the option that I choose with regards to Google, which was ECS, right? In the bracket, it was mentioned as ECS. So eDNS client subnet primarily allows an authoritative name server, you can say, to geolocate, right? And understand where exactly the query is coming from, and based on that, give a response accordingly, right? I hope that answers your question. Let me see if there are any other questions. So in case if you're just joining in, I am doing live installation of the Pi-hole project, the Pi-hole software on a Linux operating system, and which is basically Ubuntu. And based on that, we will further see the configuration of how we could use this to block ads, malware, prevent websites from tracking us, and so on. And behind the scenes, I mean, if you look at the Pi-hole project, if you go to the Pi-hole website, there are a lot of I have oversimplified a lot of things here, but there are a lot of things running behind the scenes. There is a web dashboard. There is an element which primarily looks at updating the Pi-hole. If for any updates, you can, whenever a new update comes, you can just click a button and update it to the latest version. So there is a lot of complexity behind the scenes. But in a nutshell, even if you're not a technical user, as long as you can install Pi-hole, or you can install it for family and friends, they need not worry about all the details or the intricacies of how this works, right? All right, so if you're able to see the screen, this says installation has completed, and the IP address is the IP address that I configured manually, which is 10.0.0.136. And it also tells that the Pi-hole is now accessible on the web dashboard, is accessible on 10.0.0.136/admin, right? So it's also telling us the login password. And there is no way to copy this. So what I usually do is I will say okay, and I will type the command Pi-hole-A-P, which allows us to reset the admin password, right? So let's do that. All right, great. So we have been able to install the Pi-hole, and we have also reset the web dashboard password so that we can access it easily and quickly. So let me go ahead here. I am hoping that all of you are able to see the browser. In case if you're not, please interrupt and do let me know. And if you go to the login now, and with the password that I have set up, here we go. So here we have Pi-hole successfully installed, and it's already showing us a bit of telemetry. And this telemetry is primarily coming from the operating system, which is running the Pi-hole itself. So the 13 clients, or rather 13 queries that you're seeing here, are basically DNS requests from within the OS, the Ubuntu OS, where I have installed Pi-hole, right? And there are a number of key elements that I'd like to point out. And before I do that, what I will do is I will change my DNS, my main OS DNS, so that I can use this as my DNS server. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but let me go ahead and do this. Now, if I go to the query log, if you see now, it already started changing, right? So it's already showing a bit of telemetry here. So if you go to the dashboard, there was, to begin with, there was just one client. Now you see that there are two clients which are making these queries, the DNS queries, and Pi-hole is logging that. So if I go to the query log, this basically shows you a live log of all the DNS requests which Pi-hole is seeing, right? So if I go to, say, for example, google.com, and if I go back to the Pi-hole project, as long as that was not asked before, Pi-hole is going to see and report back with all the queries, right? So here it is. So this is my query for google.com or whatever was loaded. So this is IP address is 10.0.0.117, and I access google.com. So it tells you from a visibility perspective a lot of things. And there is one additional bit that I'll also talk about in the query log, which was very interesting to see. I don't know if people were looking at that. Let me write. And here is the entry which looks a bit suspicious, right? I mean, I'm already, and this is primarily from my system, the same system that I access google.com. So you can see that there was a query that was made to not a domain name, but some random characters, right? So it looks like there is number of characters is around 14 or 15. And this originated from my system. That is a very suspicious query. Now I know for a fact, because I have looked into this before, this is what happens whenever you start Google Chrome or Chromium-based browsers, to detect if there is a captive portal, the Chromium-based browsers send a random string, which is 7 to 15 characters, primarily to understand if there is a captive portal in the network, right? And if there is a captive portal, then it shows you the captive portal page, right? So this is how behind the scenes Chromium-based browsers detect, what do you call, if there is a captive portal that resides. But having said that, if you just look at it, it basically makes you think maybe there is some malware, or maybe there is something that is communicating which is trying to make this query, right? So this is how, from a visibility perspective, Pi-hole is a great project. And already we can see that even though I have not accessed anything else, it was just google.com, something behind the scenes, applications, apps, or whatever is installed on my laptop is making these DNS requests, right? So this is one, so you can see a live log of what is happening. You can go to the dashboard, and if you scroll below, or rather before I go there, you can see that domains on block list. At the installation stage, if you remember, I was talking about the Stephen Black host file, or the Stephen Black block list. That is the one which has this total entries of 90,237 domains. And this keeps changing. So the Pi-hole will primarily, auto update and look for changes to that file, to that block list, and accordingly, change this. If I scroll a little bit at the bottom, I can see the total number of requests, volume or the count of DNS requests, and it gives a top permitted domains. It gives you an understanding of what is chatting in my network from a DNS perspective, right? And that's a great visibility to have. So this tells me that there is some application which is making a DNS query to api.github.com, and it has made 6 queries so far. So it could be a single website, it could be an application, it could be something else altogether. And then I can see that I have this one client system, which is my laptop. And this has made around 48 requests so far, right? That's a huge chunk, even though I just accessed one website. But behind the scenes, as I said, everything begins with a DNS query, right? You can do a lot of things. You can whitelist a domain. You can blacklist. Let me just take this example. Let me take blacklist as an example. Say, for example, there is an evil domain name, and I'd like to block that domain. And for the sake of example, there is one evil domain name that I'd like to take. And This is whitelist. I need to go to blacklist. I'm sorry about that. So this is one evil domain that I'd like to block, right? And as soon as I do that, if I now access Facebook, sorry, if I can type correctly, facebook.com, you see that the website, or in this case, the domain, technically the domain is not resolving. But in my network, Facebook has stopped working. The reason is because I have added this specific domain that I wanted to blacklist. I don't want this domain to resolve in my network. So this is the beauty of Pi-hole. So you could add, if you have specific domains that you don't want to resolve, you don't want those websites to work in your home network, right? So you could add them. So one is the block list. Second is you could manually add and you could block them, right? Behind the scenes, what is happening is, if I go back to the terminal, if I go to another terminal window, if I use the dig command, and if I say dig facebook.com, so dig is basically a command line tool which resides or is available for Windows as well. I'm not sure it is available on Windows, but it's certainly available on Linux and Unix platforms. It is, you can say dig is a lot more powerful than the NS lookup tool that you have on Windows, right? So dig allows you to give a domain name, and once you do that, it will print out what IP address that domain name is pointing to. So in this case, my question was, what is the IP address of facebook.com? And the answer came back saying 0.0.0.0. Technically speaking, this is not the IP address of facebook.com, but what Pi-hole has done, which is our DNS server, is that it is responding with a response saying that facebook.com is at 0.0.0.0, which technically means all IP addresses, and that doesn't work. So Facebook website doesn't load in this context, right? So I hope that is a very helpful thing to do when you want to block a specific domain. And you could also do that from the query log as well. So if you are seeing domain names which are showing up, and if you think that there is some suspicious domain name, so what you could do is, and here is the log. So I accessed facebook.com in the browser. I accessed it on the command line, and each time it was blocked by Pi-hole. And if you see, say, for example, a domain name like this that I don't want, I don't know what this domain is about, and I want to block it, you could just say blacklist and it gets added there, and it blocks that domain for the whole network. Understand that this step will happen for the whole network. There is a way in which you could do this selectively, but I'm not going to talk about that in this specific webinar. If you want to, probably look into that, you can explore group management. That is where there are ways in which you could selectively give a response. But I have not gone into more detail into doing that. There is another method that I use. Probably in the next upcoming webinars, I will talk about that. So moving back to my presentation. So once you install Pi-hole, the next thing what you need to do is, from a post-installation perspective, you will also need to configure your router, right? In a home network, a router is basically the device which is handling DHCP, that is handing out IP address in the network, and DNS as well, right? So you need to log into the router, and you need to either change the DNS so that the DNS IP address of your Pi-hole is given via DHCP, or you could disable the DHCP in your router and enable the DHCP option which exists in Pi-hole. So let me actually go ahead and show you that option. So if you go to settings, here is DHCP, and by default this is disabled. So in case if you want to go with the latter option where you would like to disable DHCP in your router, then you can enable DHCP here, and Pi-hole will hand out, basically assign IP addresses to systems in your network or devices in your network, and you don't need to change anything else. Or as I said, the other option is you keep this disabled, you don't enable it here, but in the router you need to, in your DHCP settings of your router, you need to put whatever IP address you have given to the Pi-hole, as the DNS server, so that systems, when they get a DHCP lease, they will get the Pi-hole as the DNS server, right? I hope that part is helpful. So in case if there is any follow-up question regarding that, please feel free and let me know. Here are a few block lists which you can explore, and Stephen Black is by default present in, available in the Pi-hole project itself. But having said that, the Stephen Black project also has a few additional block lists as well. So you can go ahead and explore that. There are a couple of others on GitHub. If you search for Pi-hole block lists, you will get a huge number of block lists. There are for tracking domains, blocking tracking domains, blocking YouTube ads, and whatnot. Now moving on, I mentioned about the Pi-hole uses dnsmasq as the caching and the forwarder software, right? Now, till this point of time, let me also point out that even if you don't do this step, it's all good. Even if you don't follow along, or even if you don't change to Unbound, it's absolutely fine. Pi-hole will work, without any issues. My personal preference is to change from dnsmasq to Unbound. So Unbound is a recursive resolver software by NLNet Labs, and it's an RFC compliant recursive resolver. It supports all the standards. So whenever a new DNS protocol comes in the picture, Unbound there is support for it Unbound in short span of time, right? And case in point, there is a RFC 7816, which stands for QName minimization, right? And in a nutshell, QName minimization is whenever a DNS request is sent to the name server down the delegation chain, it sends the fully qualified domain name or the entire host name to all the servers part of the delegation chain. So from a QName minimization perspective, DNS software or DNS recursive resolvers which support it, they do not send the full query. From a privacy perspective, QName minimization is great. The other important benefit of using Unbound is the fact that Unbound also is a DNSSEC validator. It does DNSSEC validation. What is DNSSEC? DNSSEC allows basically validating a domain, whatever response you are getting for a domain name. So in case if there is somebody, say a domain name is configured with DNSSEC, and you have a recursive resolver like, let's say, Unbound, and with DNSSEC validation turned on, what will happen is, if there is, let's say, a man in the middle and somebody is tampering with the response, then Unbound will not resolve that domain name. And that's a great security feature to have. But it also depends on both things, or rather, there are two elements to it. The domain name that you are accessing needs to have DNSSEC turned on, and your recursive resolver software, assuming it is Unbound, also needs to have a DNSSEC configured. So taking that into consideration, I think benefit of running Unbound is huge. Before I do that, before I go to what can possibly go wrong, let me show you how we can go ahead and change from dnsmasq to Unbound. Let me go ahead to the documentation. So if I go back, here it is. This is the part which talks about how we could do this, how we could enable this. So this is part of the official documentation. So I'm not deviating from the Pi-hole project, except that by default dnsmasq is enabled. And in the case of Unbound, you can, instead of, you don't want to use dnsmasq, you could change to Unbound. And the way you can do that is by installing Unbound to begin with. Let me scroll a little below. So let's go ahead and do that. Here is my Pi-hole. Let's install the Unbound package. And then we need to download the root.hints file. And the way we can do that is and the Unbound service may not run at this point of time. So you will see an error saying that you will see an error which talks about Unbound could not be started. And that's fine because there is already a DNS software which is running, which is dnsmasq. So Unbound trying to start at the same time will not work. So the way we can do that is download the root.hints file. So this is basically the file which has the list of the 13 root servers. That's where the delegation chain primarily begins. And once you have that downloaded, then we need to set up the pi-hole.conf file, pi-hole-conf file. This exists inside the Unbound directory. So let me open a text editor and add an entry. Apologies for all the context switching between the terminal, the presentation, and the browser. So as you can see, the default configuration, it talks about Unbound configured on a different port, not on 53, but on 5335, right? And we'll go with that because the query is going to get forwarded to the recursive resolver, which is Unbound. So moving to the next step, what we need to do is we need to restart the service. And this time around, Unbound should start. So how do you verify that? You can take any domain name, but the port number where you're sending the DNS query to has to be the port that has been configured in the pi-hole.conf, right? And when you do this, you will see that we are getting a response, and the IP address of pi-hole.net is 3.18.136.52, right? This confirms that Unbound is installed and with DNSSEC validation, and it is running on port 5335, right? Now, next thing what we need to do is we need to configure the dashboard, the Pi-hole dashboard, to primarily use. So in the earlier part, I talked about using Google ECS option. But as I said, here is another option. So instead of sending DNS or outsourcing DNS to Google, what we could do is we could disable this, and we could say, sorry, right? So we could say, don't send DNS queries to any of the open resolvers. Rather, I would like to use Unbound, which has been installed and it is running on port 5335, right? 127.0.0.1 is localhost, and this is the way you denote at on that specific port. And we can go ahead and save this particular option. So once you do this, now the upstream or Pi-hole project, the Pi-hole software is primarily going to use Unbound that has been installed as the recursive resolver, which has DNSSEC validation and which also has other features that you can primarily configure in the configuration file. So moving back to the presentation. So what can possibly go wrong? So in the context of putting a hardware in place, like let's say a Raspberry Pi in a home network, there are a few things that can potentially go wrong. And the reason I primarily have this slide is so that it gives an understanding that it's not set it and forget it. At times, things could go wrong. Let's say if you take a Raspberry Pi and you install that in a home network for maybe family or friends, and the Raspberry Pi primarily uses a memory card. There could be an issue with the memory card, or there could be an issue with the power adapter. In the context of block lists, which I talked about, as I said, the Stephen Black project has been in existence for a very long time. There are a huge number of volunteers which contribute to it. But tomorrow, let's say you add some other block list and mistakenly they add a legitimate domain in there, like let's assume google.com, then what is potentially going to happen is anyone in the home network who is trying to go to Google or has an Android phone, potentially a lot of things will stop working, right? And family and friends will potentially then call you and to make sure things get fixed as early as possible. If you're, or another potential use case is the dnsmasq or Unbound recursive resolver software. There is a bug or there's a problem with that and it crashes. So there are potentially a few things which could go wrong in that context. But having said that, the number of Pi holes that I have installed, most of them, I would say, unless or until there is a hardware issue with the Raspberry Pi that I've installed, I have not seen any issue per se. But in case, in case if you would like to get a full picture, it comprises of this as well. You would also need to maintain, or you also need to look at the hardware if something goes wrong. Because again, remember, everything on the internet begins with a DNS query. So if there is a Pi hole and the Pi hole is the DNS server for the whole network, and the Pi hole goes down, then what is potentially going to happen is internet is going to stop for everyone in the home network. Right? Here are references to all the links and all the things that I talked about in this specific talk. And apart from that, I would also urge you, in case if you're already using the Pi hole project or even Unbound, or if you start using it, both of them are open source software. You can actually donate to both the projects if you would like, and that definitely helps these projects. No affiliation to what these projects do, but I use both of these projects for a large number of time, and I think open source software also needs some love, right? This is my contact information. So in case if you have any questions, please feel free and reach out. You can tweet to me personally, or that's the Twitter handle for the company as well. Or if you'd like to have a conversation around it, feel free to join the Discord server and put your questions, or start a conversation, and that will be great. We would love to get your feedback. We have just shared the feedback form in the Zoom chat. So please feel free and submit your critical feedback, as well as any other topics or any potentially ideas or suggestions that you have with regards to the webinar. Right? So having said that, thank you for joining in, and I will pause a bit and maybe drink some water and see if there are any questions. So in case if somebody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Zoom chat, or you can also send it. If you'd like to ask a question, I can unmute you and you can ask. So Vinayak basically has a question which he is curious about. If you, and he says, if you can install netstat command on the operating system or the VM where I have the Pi-hole installed, if you can install netstat and show us a list of services which are running in the background. I don't think netstat is installed in the VM. So what I can do is I can certainly install the NetTools package, which I assume also contains netstat in it. And maybe then if that goes well, I can show you what is running behind the scenes. Any other questions, please feel free and put it in the Zoom chat. Here you go. So this is all the set of services which are running on the Pi-hole. The first one is SSH. Then the second one is Unbound, which we have installed on port 5335. Then Pi-hole-FTL. Then the web server. Again, this is SSH, and again services regarding Pi-hole. So a bunch of services running behind the scenes. Pi-hole-FTL as well as the web server is one of them, along with Unbound. Vinayak has a follow-up question. Is there any FreeBSD equivalent of Pi-hole? I am not aware of, but I believe you can explore something that I was planning to do in one of the next sessions is look at DNS response policy zones or DNS firewalls. So that is another way in which you can. So it's basically it's not a protocol yet. It's not a RFC yet. It's work in progress. There is an RFC for it, but it basically allows you to configure a recursive resolver, be it Unbound or Bind or PowerDNS, all the open source recursive resolver software, and it allows you to give a differentiated response based on who is asking, right? So that is hopefully, I will also look at doing a session on that. So if you're interested for that, DNS response policy zones is something that I'm hoping to cover, because Pi-hole is one, but also from an enterprise perspective, Pi-hole is something that you cannot put it in an enterprise network. You could, but you can't in a lot of ways. In that context, DNS response policy zones or DNS firewalls is what is helpful. So I hope that helps. But it doesn't provide you any kind of dashboard like the Pi-hole. So in that context, it is purely command line logs and stuff like that. But I'll cover that in detail, probably in maybe the next session. Let's see how it goes. Any other questions? Anything anyone would like to add on how they are using Pi-hole, or if they have a different way to do this? I'll probably give another minute for people to think of questions. And if not, then maybe we can end the webinar session. All right. So I don't see any additional questions in here. So or any points for conversation or discussion. So I think thank you for joining in. I hope this was useful. Please feel free and share your feedback with the link that my colleague Amruta has shared in the Zoom chat. And hopefully we will probably plan for based on the feedback, also plan for the next session. Thank you for joining in and have a great weekend. Thank you.